Okay, so this is just a short session with Chris, Bennett and Janine. We're going to have a discussion about their analysis of Sensemaker and how we've been using it as a sector to gather stories to look at the impact of the pandemic on staff and on our organisations. The guys here analysed data and stories that we got in from staff and from organisations since last July and up until January, and they analysed it in two phases. So the first phase was July through to October, and the second phase then was November through to the end of January. For those of you who aren't familiar with Sensemaker, Sensemaker is a tool that collect stories. It basically is anonymous, and the person telling the story analyzes their story as they go through the process. It collects qualitative and quantitative data, so you use things called triads and dyads, but then you also add narrative around it as well. To tell your story as part of the process. So I'm going to hand over and introduce you to the analysts who were a key part of this. So if you just want to give us your name and the organisation you work with. Chris, do you want to start us off?
Yeah, my name is Chris Jarrett. I work for Mellon Homes based in Bonnypool. I'm the data support officer. Been working with Mellon for approximately 18 years.
Thank you, Chris. Bennett?
I'm Bennett McVeigh. I work for Newydd Housing Association, which is based in Cardiff, but has properties predominantly in Vale of Glamorgan and the Valleys.
Lovely, thank you. And Janine?
So I'm a data and business intelligence business partner for Link Household Association, and with properties in South Wales, we use the Cardiff Newport and other local authorities.
Thank you. And we also had Robert from Family Housing and Michael from Monmouthshire Housing as part of this group, but they're unfortunately unable to make this session. So really, the first question I want to ask is, so Sensemaker is very different to how you would normally collect data, I suppose, because as I said, it's got the qualitative and the quantitative elements of it, and people self-analyze as they go through. So I suppose, as data analysts, really, how did you find the process, and how did analysing something like this compare to what you do on a day-to-day basis? Janine, do you want to kick us off?
Yes, so I mostly deal with quantitative data. So this one was quite interesting for me, but I actually really enjoyed it because it provides insights that quantitative data sometimes misses. So you can sometimes, with quantitative data, it will say something, or you can see something, but when you see the stories, it just adds some depth to it. So I really, really enjoyed it. And it made me rethink how actually to analyze certain things even in the future. So when I'm looking at quantitative data now, I'm thinking, okay, what's the story behind this? Instead of just thinking, oh yeah, well, the number is that, but like, what is the story behind it?
That's really interesting. Chris, what would you add to that?
It was different for me because normally when you're analysing something, you have a series of questions or you're looking to analyse. So when you're looking at from a data analyst point of view, you normally have somebody asking a certain amount of questions, and then you work with the data based on what they require. This one was more an open book. We didn't really have a set of questions or a set of answers. We just had a sort of set of stories that we were just going to look at and try and analyse the outcomes of those stories, which is a sort of bit of a different way of looking at things. There was never going to be, can you have a look at this or can you have a look at that? He was looking at the whole thing and trying to come up with some sort of answer of what people are trying to say. And that's a different way of working from myself or from an analyst point of view, because you are normally working within confined sort of rules of not rules as such, but ideas and what you're trying to get out of. And this was a little bit of that.
Yeah. And I think that's a really good point in terms of it was so open, because you're not asked specific questions. You were just asked, what have you seen, heard or experienced that's different? And it can be about absolutely anything. So that's one of the benefits of using Sensemaker, and that you're not confined to answering a specific question that those who want the answer to is asking. And Bennett, what would you add to that in terms of how you found it compared to what you do day to day?
Compared to what I do, it was very different. I mean, what I deal with is quantitative data only. I'm dealing with how many repairs did we do last week, how many tenants moved in last month, that sort of thing. So looking at that wider picture, the story, Yeah, that's a lot different to what I'm used to. And at first it was quite a daunting process looking at that. Much like yourself, naturally, I would start looking at the stories and start looking at trying to pick things out of them. But I think what we found going through the process of analysing it is we have to take that step back, start looking at the quantitative data, and then move on into the qualitative to prove the points that we've found from the quantitative data. I'm going to get those mixed up at some point, obviously. But do you see where I'm going with that? Yeah.
Yeah, completely. Yeah, I think that's really interesting because I've got a background in communications, and you know, it would be the storytelling fragments that I'd be mostly drawn to, and reading the stories, and then you could end up kind of down a rabbit hole, or putting things together that maybe aren't, I suppose, as they seem. So
exactly the same. Exactly.
Yeah.
That's how I approached it at first, and that's what I found daunting about that data set, because effectively, the first story you read, you'll read something, it'll put a seed into your head, and the next story you read, you're looking for that again. So you're looking to, it does lead you down that rabbit hole. So yes, having to take that step back and be a bit more rigorous about it was an interesting process to go through.
Lovely. So talk us through the process, Janine, from your point of view. So as I say, I would look at the story and then that's what I would focus on. But as Bennett said, you couldn't do that. You had to take a step back. So how did you do it? What was the process?
So actually, so we looked at the data first, because it would avoid bias, I guess, in terms of you're looking at the numbers instead of, well, because when you look at the story first, that could cloud your judgment. But if you're looking at the numbers, you get an objective picture, and then you start looking at the story. So that approach was really good, because I think at the end I did feel like the analysis we had was quite objective. It was really, really interesting. I guess because I am used to looking at quantitative data, so it was quite natural. So let's look at the numbers first. Let's look at what, and that's generally sort of my worldview in terms of like, okay, what are the statistics, and then what's the story behind. So yeah, but I do think that approach of looking at the data first avoids bias.
Lovely.
Then you can afterwards you're finding stories that support what you found, not necessarily finding you know, like trying to support the story, but you actually, you know, it's the data first and then the story after.
Yeah. And I think that's the whole point of not just doing a normal survey. It is, you know, looking at the data and then the story will back it up, as opposed to looking for what you want to find, isn't it? So yeah, really interesting.
Yeah.
Chris, what would you add to that?
I don't really add anything different, really. I mean, we looked at it from, I suppose in some ways you looked at it from a backwards point of view, in that you looked at the data first and the stories after. And quite lucky that some of my training in the past has been raw traffic management, where you look at the end outcome and then go back to the same sort of thing. You're looking at what are we trying to get from this, but doing it from a backwards point of view. So looking at the data and trying to see what the data says. And once you've done that, you've looked at it and you analysed it. When you then read the stories, you instantly get a match of data matches what the story is saying. But if you'd read the stories first, you would have thought that everything within the data would go towards a negative response. There was a lot of negative and neutral within the stories. But in the analysis, there was a lot of positive and outcomes kind of it. So there was, if you read the stories first, you wouldn't have had the analysis that we had and the objective. That's because there was a lot of negative neutral within those stories. Going from first lockdown, maybe third as we are in Wales, because we have. If we looked at the story first, you probably would have had a totally different sort of set.
Great. So both complement each other, really, don't they? And you can see the bigger picture. I suppose coming on to the findings then. So we'll share the link to the presentation that was given when we launched the findings. What was the thing that stood out the most for you, the thing that resonated the most for you? Bennett, would you like to go first on this one?
I think one thing that did stand out, because we were looking at two data points, we were looking at sort of early, the first and the second lockdown. I think the difference in emphasis between the two of them was quite obvious. I think there was a lot more urgency, a lot, possibly urgency is the wrong word, but a lot more sort of immediacy, a lot more, I'm going to do this, I will do that in the first one. with the second lockdown, the story seemed a little more relaxed. People seemed a bit more settled, and there was a lot more, we have been doing this, and a lot more sort of past tense language in there. So that stood out quite a lot as quite a difference between the 2 time points.
Yeah, and as we analyse the third lot of data, it'll be interesting to see, you know, how that shifts or changed. It might be that as
It'll be
lockdown
interesting that would be a year after the first lockdown. So yeah, that'll be quite interesting to see where it goes next, because obviously the seasons are possibly playing a part. So it will be good to see the third data point, which is effectively where the first data point was last year.
Yeah, interesting. And we'll be able to see that in a couple of weeks' time. Janine, what would you say was I suppose, the thing that stood out for you?
I think for me, generally, I think I felt there was a lot of resilience and willingness to adapt. So people, from their stories, you could see that they were looking at the silver linings. They see that this is a difficult situation, but then they're saying, okay, what can we learn from the situation? How can we adapt? And then what can we take from this so that we leave, because there's some maybe negatives from the way we've lived before that we can leave behind. So I think if you look at the work life balance, I saw a lot of stories where people are thinking, you know what, it's nice to have this balance. So it would be nice to carry on with something like this instead of maybe just going back to the way things were before. There's a lot of resilience and just looking at the bright side. But even though there's an element of people becoming more negative in the sense that I think they're becoming more stressed and tired, but they're still quite resilient and still thinking, you know what, just have to get on with it.
Yeah, so definitely a bit of a lockdown fatigue, I think, featuring.
Yes.
Definitely. Chris, what surprised you?
Probably going to give a probably different sort of answer here. In that, what surprised me more than anything was how honest people were being about their stories, because of the anonymity. They were able to discuss the issues and the problems that we were having without anybody sort of judging them beforehand. They were given, some people were given a very raw, open feeling to how they're currently feeling in this current climate. And that doesn't matter whether it would be working from home, homeschooling, lockdown, where they live, their local community. They were giving us a full, raw account of their story, and a good level of honesty. None of them felt made up or contrived, or sort of pre-written. They were all giving that sort of raw state of how they're currently feeling, and that sometimes is difficult to come across in these sort of situations. But it did come across in that way. It was a very honest.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think guts and all in some of the stories. And, again, the beauty of using Sensemaker, people can be that free and that open to tell the story that they want to tell, as opposed to a story and answering a question that we have asked. So I would completely agree with that. And then in terms of this data, so you've got the data points, you've got the stories, they're going to be available on a workbench. And what I mean by that, it's literally just a portal that people can go on to. The data is all going to be cleaned up and redacted. So if there's any personal information in there, which there shouldn't be, because as Chris said, they're anonymous, that'll all be redacted and removed. And anybody can go in and have a look around and see the data for themselves, because this is a really open and transparent process. But I suppose, you're all analysts. What advice or what would you say to people accessing the data for the first time, so that they're able to I suppose pull some trends or to kind of see some without just looking at the stories that I alluded to, which is the thing that I would go to first. So what would your advice be? Janine, do you want to take that first?
Yeah, so I'd say basically have an open mind, and look at the graphs, and probably maybe if you don't necessarily understand them, try and research just so that you really can understand what the graph is saying. But look at those graphs, and before you even look at the stories, I think if you really want to get a true idea of what it is, then look at different periods, like maybe look at the overall picture, but then also, because you can filter different periods and different organizations, just different things, just play around, like just have fun and see what you can find, because I think there's a lot to be had, but the main thing is do look at the data before you read the stories. I think you'll probably get more out of it.
Lovely, good advice, thank you. Bennett, what would you add to that?
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I think you need to look at, start looking at the graphs and the triads and dyads first, and then progress onto the stories once you've got an idea of the overall picture. Slightly counterintuitively against that is, I'd also say try and split it down and look at it in sections. One thing that we did when we were analysing was we each took a different tone and looked at it that way. So, for example, I looked at all the stories that were very positive, and by doing that, you're getting all of the stories along that same theme. So you can pick out the threads that are going through it. I think if you did try and look at everything overall all at once, you'd pick up one story that says, I'm really enjoying working from home. The next story you'd pick up could be, I absolutely hate working from home. So they're going to cancel each other out. So I think try and approach it in a more sort of regimented way would possibly help a little. That's possibly the best way I can put that.
Yeah, I think that's really good advice, isn't it? So Janine's point about go in with an open mind, have a look at everything, and then I suppose you're advocating actually, if you want to be more specific, kind of know what you want first. So look at the very positive stories, just focus on them and do it that way around. So yeah.
I suppose, yeah, you do keep an open mind, yes, but I think stepping back and looking at all of it at once, it can be quite an overwhelming amount of data. So yeah, it's try and do a bit of both, I suppose.
Lovely. Yep. Thank you. And Chris, what would you say?
For me, beforehand, I'd want to try and know what I'm trying to get from it when I'm going in there in the first place. Is when I go in there, what am I trying to find? Am I trying to look for some trends and patterns in certain stories? Or am I trying to analyze something from a very crude analytical data point of view? And you can do both. In those stories, you can do it from a very crude analytic data point of view. Or you can look at it from a storytelling, storyboard point of view. And it's all cool which way you want to do it before you go in there, before you can sort of say, this is how I'm going to work, or this is how I'm going to analyze it. So we sort of be more open-minded and not go in with a very closed.
Lovely. Thank you. Hello, Michael.
Sorry about that. My wife was on a work call on her laptop, so the Wi-Fi was working, but I couldn't get my phone to work, the laptop to work, the other laptop to work. I'm like, going, how? How are you having a conversation in a Zoom call and I can't get on anything?
Oh, listen, not to worry. We're about to wrap up. Actually, we've gone through kind of the questions, but I suppose I'll put some of them to you if that's okay. Before we finish. So what I was asking the guys was, so Sensemaker obviously analyzes or gathers the qualitative and the quantitative, and that's probably a different way that you would gather and analyze data. So how did it differ from kind of what you would do on a day-to-day basis, would you say, in your role?
I think using some of the tools they use to display the data was different. The triads and the dyads, that was quite different. But quite a lot of the time, you do use a mixture of qualitative and quantitative, particularly when it comes to surveys. You do look at score, and then if you have a why question, you are used to looking at some of the qualitative information.
Yeah. Lovely. And the guys were saying that in terms of, not looking at the stories or the narrative first, but looking at the data points and then looking for the stories then after that in terms of what might marry up. What was the key thing that stood out for you in terms of the findings, would you say?
I think the key thing is just you've got, through the stories, you've got that personal touch, and you can relate and you can give the figures that sort of human element, so people can actually see that how it's impacting on people differently. I think we too tend to lose a lot of the emotional attachment if we just look at some figures. By adding that, the story and the quotes, hopefully brings it a bit more to life and people can relate to it.
Yeah. I think just before you joined, Chris was saying how honest people were, and actually, to be able to give people a platform to be that honest, and you're not confining them, is the real benefit of using something like Sensemaker.
Yeah.
So, sorry, go
I
ahead.
was just going to add in there then, one of the things I've done to try and encourage people to tell their story is to say, look, use it as a platform to have a rant. If you need to get something off your chest, log into Sensemaker and hit the keyboard for 5 minutes and see what comes out the other side. And then you've got the questions then which sort of probe what you've just written, and it helps you be reflective and think about it rather than bottling it all up. Let it out and make it useful, because we can actually look at that and make use of it rather than you just feeling pent up anger, or that you may be over the moon about something but you can't tell anybody.
Yeah.
Perfect platform to do that.
Yeah, and I think by doing that, you're analysing as you go, so it helps you process it, you know, in terms of what you want to say as well as you go along. So yeah, completely agree with that. And we were talking about the all of this data being available to the public, and it's been available on a workbench. And I was asking the guys what tips would they give people for you know, looking at the data set for the first time. Is there any advice you would give, Michael, in terms of somebody who's not who doesn't have a background in data analysis, but who wants to go in and have a nosy around and see what's on there?
It's difficult to answer until you see what the platform looks like. If there's lots of figures, I'd say don't be overawed by them. But then, of course, you tend to need somebody to talk you through if there's lots of figures. So yeah, I'd wait until we see the platform and then you can provide a bit of advice.
Yeah, and I think we will be able to provide sessions for anybody who might be interested in accessing the workbench and seeing how they might use it. So we'll be able to follow up with something like that. Is there anything else anybody else would like to add about the experience of doing this as a collective before we wrap up?
Just from a personal perspective, you know, something that's come up as we've been going along. It's been quite enlightening to see some of these stories and read through some of them, because personally speaking, you read something and you think someone's just put into words exactly how I felt about something. So just personally speaking, not as a data analyst analyzing the data, just as a person. And I suppose that would go for anyone who's looking at that data. Yeah, you will find that in some of the stories, and it's quite heartening to see.
Yeah, I completely agree. Anybody else, anything to add? Similar reflections, Janine?
Yeah, I really found it really useful. I guess initially we were sort of all not really sure what we're supposed to do, but eventually we got around to it. And I think the whole experience for me has given me that ability to think beyond the numbers, because when you're looking at a lot of data, you know, you stop thinking about the people behind it. But these stories really show you that everything it's always about people. It's always about how people feel and things like that. So I think it's really given me a new way of thinking about it. So now a lot of the analysis that I'm doing, I've actually started thinking, well, can we introduce some stories here and there, just so we can just add some flavor to these numbers. So yeah, it's for me, I think it's been really useful, and it's given me a new way of looking at things and wanting to analyze things in the future.
Lovely. Thank you.
I'd just add as well, it's been nice working with people from other organisations in similar roles and similar skill sets, and who understand data and embrace data. You don't have to go over that first barrier of going, somebody says, I'm not a data person, I don't do Excel. we can skip all that and just go and talk about it, and it's nice. It's a nice change.
Yeah. And I think one of the things that we agreed very early on was because you've all volunteered your time for this, we thought, do we take it in turns? And Janine does it this month and Bennett does it next month. But actually you felt, no, as a collective, that you would all bring something to it and be able to have those conversations and cross-reference your findings. And I think that was a big benefit as well. So yeah, so just to say thank you so much for your time and for analysing the latest round of stories. We will be analysing the stories that were gathered in February, and we'll be launching them as the partnership, the live learning partnership, over the next couple of weeks. But we'll keep you posted. Just keep an eye on our social media. So thank you very much. If you have any questions, please do just drop me a line.